Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So in anticipation for the release of Avengers Endgame, I'm going to be doing a couple of videos talking about my 5 favorite things about Avengers Infinity War and 5 things that I absolutely hated. So I've already posted the 5 things that I loved. So today we're going to be talking about the 5 things that I absolutely hated. Now, whilst hated is a very strong word, I do think that there were elements to this film that really did not gel with me. They didn't quite make sense in my opinion. So without further ado, we're going to be talking about the 5 things that I absolutely hated about this film. That's not to say that I hated the film in general. Actually, before we get started, I do want to mention that this video is going to be in order of things that bother me the least to things that bother me the most. So without further ado, now let's get into the list. The first thing that annoyed me about this film is how characters seem to act completely out of character. So the best thing about the MCU is the fact that it's developed these characters that we've grown to know and love over the course of many films. And at this point of Avengers Infinity War, there had been 19 films that had established different story arcs and different character developments throughout the different franchises extremely well. And so when things were a bit out of character, I definitely noticed it. Now, the first thing that people were talking about was Star-Lord and his reaction when he finds out that Gamora has been killed in service of Thanos' plan. And whilst it was annoying at first seeing him kind of break Thanos' trance that was induced by Mantis and wanting to beat him up, whilst that was frustrating at the time, it kind of makes sense when you take into account his character, because it was already established in the Guardians films, particularly Guardians 2, that he's a very impulsive and irrational character. He thinks very much with his heart, and this was shown when he broke out of the trance that Ego put him in, when he found out that Ego was the reason why his mother died of cancer. So that actually kind of lined up with me and it didn't really bother me as much. But there are other things that don't quite make sense. The worst perpetrators of this are in Cap's team. Now, Team Cap was concerned with trying to keep Vision alive whilst at the same time separating the mind gem from his forehead and trying to basically have their cake and eat it too. I feel like it was a very strange mission for them to have, in particular because of their characterizations. It didn't quite line up with their MO. So for example, you have Captain America, whose whole deal is that he's willing to sacrifice himself in the first Avenger in order to save millions and millions of people. And so he drives that Valkyrie straight into the ice, dooming himself, but that's part of his legacy. And in fact, Vision even comments on this in the film, saying that he was prepared to sacrifice himself, so why can't Vision sacrifice himself also? But it's kind of brushed off, and Steve's claim is, oh, no man gets left behind, which is all well and good for a field trip, but when you're dealing with the end of the universe, like, it didn't quite gel for me. It didn't make sense. So in my opinion, I felt like his character was a bit off and it was kind of in service of the plot, because in reality the Cap that we know would have been like, listen, Vision, I get that you're a real boy now, but you're gonna have to take one for the team because billions, if not trillions of lives are at stake here. And perhaps you could argue that Cap wouldn't have been the one to say that explicitly, but Black Widow definitely would have spoken up. In the past, she has shown that she's very much utilitarian in her approach to missions, and I feel like, again, this went straight against that, because she was more than okay with having one person take priority over the entirety of the universe. So it definitely felt against her own MO as well, and definitely didn't line up with her priorities, which she's already established, especially for example in the early Avengers films where she was working for S.H.I.E.L.D., and definitely during Civil War when she says, listen, we're just going to have to sign the accords for the sake of keeping the team together. Like, that's what matters, is keeping the team together, not how they're kept together. In this case, what would really matter is keeping the universe together, not how it is kept together. But you know what, even for these two, you could make the argument that they are teammates and they have an affection towards Vision, although I'll argue that that's never really been established properly, but whatever. But what doesn't make sense is Black Panther actually willingly taking on this mission to Wakanda. Now, the thing is that Black Panther is a king. He's a completely different type of character to the others. His priorities are keeping his people safe. He is their protector. The fact that he welcomes all of these issues and all of these problems and the plan that they have formulated half-heartedly to basically save Vision with the really high risk of exposing the mind gem to Thanos and his goons, that to me is completely out of character. There is no way that a king would take that risk upon himself and his people to have that battle happen on his ground. And yes, Wakanda is very well defended. It has the vibranium, it has the shields. But ultimately, I feel like at some point in time, before things escalated to that point, T'Challa would have been like, listen, we get it, you wanted to save Vision, but the way that I see it, there's only one way to do this. Shuri, I'm gonna have you break this whole stone up into little pieces so that Thanos never gets his hands on it. But instead, you have him just agree to the plan that has no real benefit to him personally or his people. Sure, Vision could prove to be useful in the fight, but he hasn't proven to be useful yet. In contrast, you have a character like Tony Stark, who's been established as being very paranoid with this whole situation. He's been having dreams or nightmares about this since the first Avengers film, and his immediate reaction is to take it to Thanos' home ground so that the fight could be taken there. Overall, the way that the character was depicted was a little lackluster. Clearly, Marvel did not anticipate the huge storm that became Black Panther. I would say that the decisions that he makes in this film definitely do not reflect the character that we come to know in his own film. And number 4, I would say that there are elements of Infinity War that definitely undercut some of the films that preceded it. In particular, I wanted to hone in on Guardians 1 and Thor Ragnarok. Now, in the case of Guardians 1, one of the most powerful things about Thanos is that he is introduced already as a badass. We see him killing Loki, the huge villain of the first Avengers film, with just a flick of his wrist, and it's established that he is not one to be messed with. And that's amazing that the film does that. In fact, it's one of the things that I loved about the film, which I mentioned in my previous video. However, I would say that the fact that he comes into the scene with already having obtained the power gem, something that was such a huge plot device in the first Guardians film, kind of undercuts that film. We don't get to see the damage that he caused on Xandar. We don't really get to see the Nova Corps response to Thanos' invasion. We don't really get to see any of the huge impact that he had on that planet, even though that was a huge, again, plot point in the first Guardians film. That was the whole point, was to protect it. It was all about the Guardians trying to work alongside the Nova Corps to protect that gem and make sure it never got into the hands of Ronan the Accuser. And the fact that Thanos already has it and it's kind of just mentioned in passing, Guardians didn't even seem that bothered about it. They swiftly moved on. It doesn't really do justice to the stakes of the first Guardians film. I would say that Infinity War's impact on Thor Ragnarok is even more significant though, because I feel like the whole purpose of Thor Ragnarok was to establish the rebirth of Asgard. Asgard is not a place, it is the people. And as soon as you have the ending of Thor Ragnarok establishing that Thor is off to find a new place for his people and he's now the king in control and his relationship with Loki has been reconciled. But then mere moments after the bittersweet ending, you have Thanos' entrance and he comes in and kills off half the already depleted population. He kills off Loki and it kind of reverses everything that was built up in Thor Ragnarok. So whenever you go back and watch that film, that ending has lost its gravitas, because you know that in the next film everyone ends up dead anyways, or at least half of everyone that survived. And also just small things like the fact that Thor loses his eye in Thor Ragnarok by his sister, and yet in the next film he ends up with another eye, in a very funny exchange with Rocket, to be fair, but still it kind of undercuts that sacrifice that he made, because now he just has a replacement. In general, when it comes to this point, I feel like it's largely just going back and rewatching those films. the impact of Infinity War can definitely be felt. And I think that's just part of the growing pains of having created the MCU, this completely new entity, because even if you watch a TV show and you have the mid-season finale, that will not have the same impact after you've watched the finale of the entire season. It just won't. At number 3, we have the strange relationship problem. Now, this genuinely annoyed me and even baffled me about the film, because we are asked to be invested in relationships that have been so shallowly established in the previous films that it is just mind-boggling. Everyone knows that the MCU for the most part is rather asexual, and this is because it's a 4-quadrant franchise. It has to appeal to everyone from the ages of 5 to 45, and so things tend to be more sterilized and PG when it comes to the romantic department. But a consequence of that is that the romantic relationships between, for example, Steve and Peggy, or Scott Lang and Hope, they're very sterilized and very PG, and that's all well and good. That's perfectly fine, except this film asks us to be invested in relationships that are at worst just sitcom breaks within a civil war, and at best a will they won't they relationship. Now, first I'm going to address Peter and Gamora, and like I said, people had a huge reaction to Peter completely ruining the plan because he got really upset about Gamora's death. And I feel like whilst that was in line with his character, because he's impulsive and he's irrational, the relationship there does not warrant that kind of reaction, in my opinion. I feel like the reaction of the other Guardians was more in line with what we had been set up for, because the whole Peter and Gamora thing was almost always like a will they won't they. They definitely swayed towards they will in Guardians 2, but it was never established as this huge romantic love story between them. And so the fact that such a huge part of the emotional crux of this film relies on that is so bizarre to me. To be fair, a really deep emotional moment was when Gamora asks Peter to kill her if Thanos ever gets his hands on her in order to protect the whereabouts of the Soul Gem. That to me was kind of meaningful and impactful, but for the most part, Peter's whole revenge fest for what happens to Gamora was a bit exaggerated, but that was still nowhere near as criminal as the emphasis that was put on Vision and Wanda's relationship. This to me made absolutely no sense. The only inkling of that budding relationship that we had gotten thus far had been in Civil War when they were bonding over paprikash. It was nothing more than a comedy sitcom moment that was a break from all of the tension that was surrounding the entire film. The fact that this now becomes the emotional crux of the Earth sequences in the film is ludicrous to me. They were definitely trying to play catch up on the relationship that has been, no doubt, well established in the comics, but in here it made absolutely no sense. We jumped from A to Z real quick, and all of a sudden Wanda is feeling this intense conflict about sacrificing the love of her life in order to get that stone that's smack bang in the middle of his head. And it makes absolutely no sense to me. It wasn't convincing at all. I know that they have had moments that have hinted at their romantic relationship, but not like this. Nothing that would have warranted this huge jump. Every single time I saw them on screen, I was rolling my eyes because this is the least favorite part of this film. But that still didn't make it to number 1 on my list, because whilst it was annoying, there still were things that they could have done in order to improve it. I feel like my top 2 things that I hated were just intrinsically problematic. At number 2, Thanos' plan doesn't make sense. It doesn't make any sense by any stretch of the imagination. Now, I know that this is a comic book movie. Nothing really makes sense. Nothing is real. It's all made up. Fine. But even in the context of the MCU, his plan doesn't make any sense. His whole deal is that he wants to halve the population of the universe and re-establish the balance after he saw what happened to his own planet, Titan, when their resources were completely depleted. Now, this is all well and good, but the population of what? What population is he referring to? If you're talking specifically about Earth, just putting the whole universe aside, it's hard to determine what the population he's referring to is, because if he's specifically saying humans, and in the film he does tell Tony Stark on Titan, I hope they remember you, there will be 50% of humans left afterwards. If he's just referring to humans, then his plan won't work, because humans aren't the only organisms that are taking up resources on our planet. They're probably the worst and most egregious, but they're not the only ones. Then the bigger problem is if he's referring to all of the organisms on planet Earth, just using Earth as an example, that still wouldn't accomplish his mission. Either all of the organisms would be affected by the snapping evenly and equally, so that half of every single species would be killed off. In that case, you have the same problem with resources, because crops would die out, cattle would die out, no more sheep, no more meat, no more vegetable, no more oxygen available on the planet even, because half of the Amazon forest has been destroyed. The problem still remains, it's just on a smaller scale. The only resource that you've been able to attain there is space. In the second scenario, every single species is not affected equally, and so you have, in some cases, 100% of the species being wiped out, and in others only a quarter, in others only a 16th. So you could end up with a world where there are absolutely no more humans, but still tons of spiders and only 70% of squirrels left behind. Overall, half of the Earth's population would have been eradicated, but then resources would still be depleted because you have disrupted the natural order of things. And I know it's a lot of thought to put into this film. It's just a Disney film, it's just a comic book movie, but his plan makes no sense. If anything, it would create even more chaos, as he's just eradicated half of the universe. And what makes it worse is that not only does the plan not make sense, but the means by which he wishes to carry it out doesn't really line up with the end goal. He has the Infinity Gauntlet, which basically gives him the power of a god, and he wants to carry out a mission with it that he's already been doing pretty successfully from our understanding. The only thing that it would kind of do is maybe extradite the process, and giving him the space stone would mean he'd be able to travel across different dimensions really easily. With the addition of the power stone, which gives him the power to push things around and stuff. But ultimately, the idea that these specific stones, like space, time, mind, the ether, whatever that is, would come together to eradicate half of the universe in a snap doesn't really line up to me. Now, I'm not saying that the ends need to justify the means, because he's the villain. He doesn't have a moral compass, but the device that he uses does need to line up to the end result. And for me, it was a bit bizarre that all he had to do was snap his fingers upon getting all of the gems. And also, how did he even know that snapping his fingers would accomplish his goal? But still, that's not my least favorite thing of this film, because ultimately it is a comic book movie and I'm giving it way too much thought. I already know that. I just wanted to vent. I think the fact that he is a mad titan goes a long way to just yada yada the intricacies of his plan. But what can't be yada yada is number one on my most hated things about this film, and that is the way that the Infinity Gems are used. That the fact that this film is called Infinity War, you would expect that the stones would be used in cool and creative ways. Firstly, you have the Power Stone, which, like I said, Thanos is able to get off screen, not even important enough for us to see him attaining it. And what kind of power does it control? Is it political? Is it social power? No, nothing that complex. It just kind of pushes people around and knocks them off balance a bit. Secondly, we have the Space Stone. Now, I actually think it was used pretty well because it's a teleportation device. It essentially allows him to travel across the universe free of charge without a special travel pass. Those are expensive, so he cut corners and he was able to get from here and there and everywhere, no problem. Thirdly, you have the Reality Stone. Oh god. Do you guys remember when this stone used to be called the Ether, and in Thor the Dark World it was this mysterious power that was able to possess people and make people do weird evil things, and something about planets aligning? Well, none of that matters now, because the power gem is essentially just able to manipulate people's perception of reality rather than actually changing reality. There's a difference there, because if he's able to use the Power Stone to change reality, his goal has already been accomplished without even getting the rest of the stones, because he would be able to establish a reality where the resources would never be depleted, where everyone would have an abundance of food and money and everything that they need with no problem. Instead, what we get is a red version of the Mind Stone. He's able to manipulate people's perception of what is happening, which is why when they go to nowhere, they see that sequence with the collector and it doesn't really happen in real life. But that's kind of impeding on the powers of the Mind Stone, which we'll get to in a second. But to me, that's kind of a missed opportunity, because the Reality Stone is so much more than just a mind tricking device. Speaking of the Mind Stone, how underutilized was Scarlet Witch in this film? Let's think about it for a second. Let's think back to 2015 when this character was introduced as an unstoppable force. Along with her telekinetic abilities, she was able to manipulate the mind of the Avengers and make them see horrors or realities that didn't exist in their minds and really shake them up. Now her powers have just been relegated to telekinesis, and that's pretty much it. And it was such a missed opportunity, because of all the people there in Wakanda, she would have been able to manipulate the minds of Proxima Midnight and even Thanos when he showed up. Now, sure, that would have been an easy fix and movies got a movie, but they should have made a point of that, of her attempting to do that at the very least, and Thanos fighting that off using, I don't know, the Reality Stone or something. Because the fact that she never even attempts it, the fact that ever since Age of Ultron, when she ultimately became a good guy, she lost that ability to mind control, it's very bizarre to me. This is a character that is extremely powerful, and yet her powers have been hindered significantly to the point where she's not nearly as useful as she could have been. Okoye even says, like, why was she up there? Well, she was up there protecting the love of her life, Vision, when she should have been down there ending that fight within minutes. And speaking of Vision himself, let's not forget that he's the one with the Mind Stone straight on his forehead, and he was of no use in this film at all. Which begs the question, what are they planning on doing with Captain Marvel? Because you have these really powerful characters like Vision, Scarlet Witch, the Hulk, that were all very much restricted in this film in order to give other characters, I guess, something to do, because otherwise the fight would be far too short-lived. But then why introduce another all-powerful character who is essentially been established as even more powerful than the most powerful characters in Infinity War? Is it just so they can hinder her powers as well? Because in that case, I wouldn't find that very compelling. I think they should just hone in on the characters that already have been established as incredibly powerful, who definitely need to step up their game and show their worth. The Soul Stone doesn't really play a huge part in this particular story. Maybe it'll play a huge part in Avengers Endgame, so I can't really judge its impact in the way that it was used, aside from the fact that it of course required a blood sacrifice in order to be activated. And then you also have the Time Stone, which again I think has a very straightforward power set that completely makes sense, and it was used very effectively at the very end there. I will say that there should have been more of an attempt from Doctor Strange to rewind the events that happened in Titans, stop Peter Quill from preventing them from getting that gauntlet off and saving the day. But again, movie's got a movie, so I understand that particular point. Finally, a bonus thing that I really hated about this film, especially when I first saw it, although now that the heart has grown fonder and the follow-up is coming out next week, was the fact that this film does not really stand alone on its own. It's definitely a companion piece to Endgame, and I wasn't really expecting that, because I know that initially it was going to be a two-parter with Infinity War Part 1 and Infinity War Part 2. Then they changed the name for marketing reasons, but I assumed that with that change there was a few narrative changes accompanying it. But no, ultimately Infinity War is definitely the first half of a two-part story, and I wasn't aware of that when I first went to watch the film. So I was disappointed by the ending at the beginning, because not for a second did I believe that Spider-Man was going to be dead. Not even for a millisecond did I believe that Black Panther was going to be dead, especially after he just made $1.3 billion at the box office. Like, no. Not even a little bit. And so whilst there were people around me who did cry at that ending, and I'll give them that. They definitely got an emotional response from others. Me personally, I was not convinced by that ending at all. But now that the film is close by, I'm very much looking forward to how Infinity War wraps up with Endgame, and I'm super, super excited to see where the story takes us next. So that is it from me. I had told you the 5 things that I absolutely hated about Infinity War, a film that I ultimately adore. Now you guys can tell me what your thoughts were about the film down in the comments below. Do you love it, or do you have things that you hate about it as well? Let me know. Please be sure to subscribe to my channel so you can catch my next videos, including my review of Endgame when it comes out. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!